You've heard the phrase Putin miscalculated 1,000 times, but most channels never tell you what he actually miscalculated. They just say he was wrong and move on. That's lazy analysis. Because if you don't understand why Putin invaded, you'll never understand why he's losing. And more importantly, you'll never understand the strategy that changed everything. This is war conflict. Today we're doing a strategic autopsy of Putin's defeat, not the surface-level mistakes, the fundamental miscalculations that made this war unwinnable from the start. 3 parts. First, Putin's 3 fatal assumptions about Ukraine and the West. Second, the intelligence failure that left Russian commanders blind. Third, the Ukrainian strategy that turned the tide and sealed Russia's defeat. Let's start with what Putin got catastrophically wrong. When Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, he wasn't making a random decision. He was acting on a set of assumptions that his intelligence services and advisors had reinforced for years, and those assumptions were spectacularly wrong. The first assumption: Ukraine would collapse. Putin had long dismissed Ukraine as an artificial state with no unifying national identity. He seems to have genuinely believed that as soon as Russian troops invaded, the Ukrainian military would flee the battlefield and Ukrainians would greet Russian soldiers with flowers. There were even reports of invading Russian units bringing their parade uniforms along, ready for the inevitable victory celebrations. Instead, Ukraine unified, resisted, and stunned the watching world. The Kremlin failed to understand that for the Ukrainian people, the invasion was a unifying, historic moment, a war of national survival. They didn't see Russian soldiers as liberators, they saw them as invaders. The second assumption: the West would fold. Moscow believed that Europe's reliance on Russian energy would tie Western hands. Putin's elites were convinced that when push came to shove, Western countries would prioritize their economic relationship with Russia over defending Ukraine. They thought the West would protest, impose some symbolic sanctions, and then come crawling back. Ex-President Medvedev stated this belief explicitly at the infamous National Security Council session on the eve of the invasion. He claimed that after minor setbacks, Western states would come begging to resume relations. Instead, the West imposed unprecedented sanctions, froze over $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, and provided Ukraine with billions in military aid. The third assumption: Russia's military was invincible. Putin's commanders appear to have been genuinely dismissive of Ukraine's military capabilities. They clearly did not think the Ukrainian military was capable of waging a modern war, but the initial stage of the invasion exposed the underwhelming reality behind Russia's military superpower pretensions. The Russian army struggled to conduct combined arms operations and demonstrated a distinct lack of imagination. The Russian Air Force was unable to establish control of the skies over Ukraine. As one analyst put it, Putin's ill-judged war is now publicly and repeatedly putting the Russian heartlands in jeopardy. But here's what no one is talking about. Stick with me. Because the miscalculations weren't just about the West. They were about Ukraine itself. And this is where the intelligence failure becomes truly staggering. Russia's intelligence machinery failed strategically and tactically. Its leaders were surprised, its forces were lost. The famous 40-mile traffic jam was the visual metaphor for an army that wasn't ready to fight because its leaders didn't think it would really have to. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a strategic culture that had been rotting for decades. Russian intelligence maintained a besieged fortress mindset, the belief that Russia is perpetually under threat. This mindset created 3 features that poisoned pre-war intelligence gathering. First, a reluctance to provide unwelcome news to political leaders. If the boss doesn't want to hear it, you don't say it. Second, a disinclination to consider information that challenges political orthodoxy. If it contradicts the narrative, it's dismissed. Third, a culture of deference to hierarchy. Lower-ranking intelligence officers don't challenge their superiors, and superiors don't challenge the Kremlin. Putin had created an elaborate confirmation bias system. He was surrounded by people who told him exactly what he wanted to hear, and everyone else stayed silent. The result? Russian intelligence penetrated Ukrainian institutions extensively. They had sources inside the SBU. They had access to Ukrainian communications. They had all the raw intelligence they needed. But their reporting proved to be too optimistic. They interpreted the intelligence through the lens of their assumptions. Ukraine was weak. Ukraine would collapse. Ukraine would welcome Russian liberators. And then February 24th happened, and everything they believed was wrong. Let me breathe here for a second. I've been covering this war for over 2 years on this channel, and I will be honest with you. When I first started researching Putin's miscalculations, I thought I understood them. Hubris, arrogance. the usual dictator overreach. But the more I dug into the analysis, the more I realized how deep this failure went. This wasn't just one man's ego. This was a system designed to tell the leader what he wanted to hear. A system that had been corrupted for so long that it couldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy. And here's the thing that gets me. Putin's analysts had all the information they needed. They knew Ukraine was resistant, they knew the West was angry, they knew their own military had problems, but they couldn't say it. Because in Putin's Russia, you don't bring bad news to the Tsar. That's not a military failure, that's a structural failure, and it's the reason this war was lost before the first shot was fired. Okay, back to the analysis. So Putin invaded, Ukraine survived, the West didn't fold. But surviving is not winning. Ukraine needed a strategy to actually defeat Russia, and they found one. Strategy 1. The drone revolution. The proliferation of drones has fundamentally transformed warfare in Ukraine. What began as a war of movement has become a war of attrition, with a kill zone stretching at least 10 kilometers from ground zero on both sides of the front line. Robotic systems can now strike enemy targets on land, in the air, and at sea. Ukraine has proved highly adept at this innovative form of warfare. In many cases, Ukrainian military commanders have sought high-tech solutions in order to counter Russia's overwhelming advantages in manpower and conventional firepower. Ukraine now boasts a large and sophisticated domestic drone industry, with developers constantly upgrading existing models based on real-time combat feedback. Ukraine's remarkable defense tech progress since 2022 has positioned the country at the cutting edge of drone technologies. According to The Hill, the logistical control established by these Ukrainian aerial forces has led to numerous strikes on enemy equipment behind the lines. Strategy 2. The Deep Strike Campaign. Ukraine has dramatically expanded its long-range strike capabilities. Drones and missiles now hit targets over 1,200 kilometers deep into Russian territory. As one analyst noted, the point where the Ukrainians are capable of striking Moscow and St. Petersburg, hundreds and hundreds of miles from the Ukrainian territories, that's a pretty significant sign that Russia has lost control of the momentum of the war. Ukraine's strategy is systematic. According to its defense minister, Kyiv's aim is to systematically destroy enemy logistics and supply lines, stripping them of their capacity to mount offensive actions. The result? Russian forces have lost more territory than they gained in May for the first time since 2023. Ukraine has recaptured more than 600 square kilometers of territory this year. Strategy 3. The technological siege. Instead of the classic encirclement of cities by infantry and tanks, the armed forces of Ukraine are moving toward total fire blockade of enemy logistics through the mass use of drones. As one observer put it, all territory occupied by Russian troops and beyond Ukrainian control will sooner or later become lethally dangerous for Russians. Donetsk and Luhansk may ultimately be encircled, not by heavy Ukrainian equipment, but by Ukrainian drones. The Institute for the Study of War has analyzed Putin's recent behavior and drawn a clear conclusion. Russia's mass strikes on Kyiv are aimed at taking advantage of Patriot interceptor shortages and distract from Russia's inability to secure its deep rear from Ukrainian long-range strikes, as well as from its battlefield setbacks. Putin is using massive strike packages in an effort to break Ukraine's will to fight, as well as to disguise his weakness, particularly his inability to secure Russian territory, including Russia's capital, from Ukraine's deep strikes. He is also seeking to recover from the embarrassment of having had to ask Ukraine permission to hold even a dramatically scaled-down Victory Day parade on May 9th. That is not a leader who is winning. That is a leader who is panicking, and the data proves it. Russia has suffered roughly 500,000 soldiers killed since the full-scale invasion began. For the 5th consecutive month, Ukraine has been killing Russian servicemen faster than Putin can recruit their replacements. Russia's recruitment rate is now below its loss rate for the 4th month in a row. In January alone, it suffered 9,000 more casualties than it was able to replace. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Russia has lost over 4,000 main battle tanks and nearly 9,000 armored fighting vehicles, between 63% and 67% of its pre-war inventory. These are the largest armored vehicle losses Russia has suffered since World War II. The war is not a stalemate. It is escalating, and Russia is losing. As the IISS concluded, the apparent equilibrium of power is unstable. Rather than inducing moderation, it is driving escalation. Russia cannot break the front line. It cannot protect its rear. It cannot replace its losses faster than it suffers them. Putin has 3 options. His army can't deliver victory. He can't force Ukraine into submission as long as European financial support holds. And buying time only makes Russia weaker. As former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt put it, Any end to the war in which Ukraine remains sovereign and independent will represent a loss for Putin. Here is how you help this channel. First, share this video with someone who thinks Russia is winning, because Russia is not winning, it's bleeding out. Second, comment below. Do you think Putin will ever admit he was wrong, or will he double down until Russia collapses? I read every comment. Third, subscribe to War Conflict if you have not already. We do not hype, we do not lie. We give you the strategy underneath the headlines. This is War Conflict. Putin didn't just miscalculate, he built a system designed to tell him what he wanted to hear. And that system led him into a war he cannot win. His three assumptions, that Ukraine would collapse, the West would fold, and his military was invincible, were wrong. Every single pillar of his pre-war strategy has crumbled. The strategy that changed everything was Ukraine's willingness to innovate. Drones, deep strikes, technological siege, a nation that refuses to accept defeat. This war is not over, but Russia's victory is. See you in the next one.